Out in the blistering silence of the desert, where heat bends the air and hope dries up faster than creek beds in July, a lone cowboy reached the last drop of his canteen. His horse was limping, his lips cracked like old leather, and the wind carried nothing but dust and ghosts. Any man with sense would have guarded that last swallow like gold. But when he saw a stranger collapsed in the distance, sunburnt, half buried in sand, and breathing in rattled gasps, he didn't hesitate. Without asking who the man was, without weighing what he might lose, the cowboy knelt beside him and tipped the final drops of water between the stranger's lips. No name was exchanged, no promise made. The stranger muttered a weak thank you before falling into unconsciousness, and by the time the sun climbed higher, the cowboy had vanished, back into the emptiness, thirst gnawing at his ribs, guided only by instinct and a quiet, stubborn decency. In that vast and lawless land, kindness wasn't just rare, it was dangerous. Giving away your last water was more than foolish. It was suicide. But this wasn't just any man. This was someone who had lost much, and learned that sometimes, when you have nothing left, that's exactly when you must give. He didn't do it for reward. He didn't know the stranger wore royal blood under all that dust, or that by sunset the next day, the horizon would shimmer not with mirages, but with 5 regal banners cresting a ridge and the thunder of hooves too many to count. He didn't know that kings would ride to meet him, bearing gifts not of silver or coin, but of life itself. Horses, strong and proud, offered as thanks from nations that never forgot a debt of honor. He couldn't have known that a single act in the heat of mercy would echo across empires. The townsfolk who watched it all unfold could barely speak. They had mocked the cowboy days earlier for helping a man who looked like nothing but trouble. Yet now they stood in silence as foreign monarchs dismounted before him, not as rulers, but as sons paying respect. And still, the cowboy said nothing, just nodded once, and looked out toward the desert, as if searching for the next soul in need. His gesture had been simple, but it had drawn the eyes of kings, and etched his name into the heart of a land that rarely remembered anything but violence. This is the story of what happens when courage and compassion meet under the cruel sun, when one man chooses love over survival, and the world answers with awe. Stay with us as we uncover how a dying gift of water turned a forgotten rider into a legend remembered by kings. The man's name was Elijah Boone. He wasn't born into greatness, nor did he seek it. Folks around the border towns just called him Boone, and most forgot he even existed. He rode alone, never settled, never stayed in one town more than a week. His horse, a worn chestnut mare named Juniper, was his only companion. He had no land, no badge, no family. But there was something in the way he carried himself. Not proud, not loud, just steady. Like a man who had seen enough of life to know that the greatest strength comes from silence, and the deepest kindness never announces itself. The desert had taken much from Boone. Years before, he had buried his younger brother beneath a tree that no longer grew leaves. Drought had claimed the land, and sickness took what water had spared. Since then, Boone kept to himself. He'd ride until the horizon disappeared, then ride some more. It was in that endless wandering, somewhere near the crossing between 3 forgotten territories, that he found a stranger, a man blistered beyond recognition, eyes rolled back, lips cracked like canyon walls. Boone didn't ask questions. He just gave. He had only one canteen left. He hadn't tasted water in hours himself, but he unscrewed the cap, cradled the man's head with care, and let the last of it trickle between the stranger's swollen lips. Then he wrapped the man in his own coat, placed him in the shade of a broken wagon wheel, and walked away with nothing but the sun on his neck and dust in his mouth. There was no heroism in his steps, just choice, just instinct. The kind of instinct born from having once needed mercy and remembering the pain of not receiving it. By nightfall, Boone had collapsed beside a dry creek bed, his tongue too swollen to speak, his hands trembling with exhaustion. He expected to die there, quietly, nameless, just another soul swallowed by the sand. But the West, in all its cruelty, has a way of watching those who walk through it with clean hands. And before the stars blinked to life, a sound like thunder rose from the distance. Not from clouds, but hooves. Many, dozens, maybe more. Carriages, lanterns, voices shouting in tongues Boone didn't recognize. He opened his eyes just enough to see the shimmer of metal and silk in the moonlight. One man dismounted and knelt before him, weeping. Another placed a hand on Boone's chest and spoke a word that translated only as brother. Boone was too far gone to understand. But the stranger he had saved, now draped in royal cloth and surrounded by warriors, looked at him with reverence. The gift of water had crossed kingdoms, and now kings knelt before the man who had given his last drop without hesitation. The next morning, when Boone awoke, he was lying in a shaded tent stitched with gold thread, his hands cleaned and bandaged, his lips cooled by fresh spring water. He didn't recognize the faces around him, men in armor, women in robes, servants who moved with quiet discipline. But at the center of them all stood the man he had saved. His name, as it turned out, was Prince Kalen of the Eastern Tribes, heir to 5 desert realms that spanned farther than any map dared to show. Lost during a peace journey, left behind by his own due to an ambush, Kalen had been given up for dead. The gesture Boone had made, silent, selfless, final, had not only saved the prince's life, it had sparked something far larger. Word of his sacrifice had traveled faster than fire on dry grass. The 5 kings, allies only by treaty and bloodline, had all ridden out together, something they hadn't done in over 20 years. Not for war, not for gold, but for honor. In the code of their people, no debt outweighed the saving of son, especially by a man with no reason, no gain, and no name to claim. When Boone sat up, dazed and still weak, they offered him everything: coin, land, silk robes, even a place among their own warriors. But he refused. With a dry smile, he simply asked for his horse. The kings, stunned by his humility, insisted on repaying him in their own way. And so, each returned to their kingdom and sent forth a single stallion, the finest from their stables, 5 in total, 1 from each realm. Horses bred for battle and ceremony, adorned with markings that told stories of generations. They arrived at Red Hollow one by one, trailing banners and legends behind them. The townsfolk had never seen such creatures, or such reverence paid to one of their own. For days, the 5 horses stood in the town square, unmoved and unclaimed, until Boone returned, quiet as always, dust on his boots, saddle slung low. Children gathered in silence. Elders crossed their arms in awe, and the same men who once called him a fool for giving his last water now lowered their heads as he passed. He didn't ride the horses. He didn't even touch them. He simply nodded in gratitude and asked that they be given to those who had none. That moment changed everything, not just in Red Hollow, but across the West. Stories spread faster than gunfire, of a man who gave everything to a stranger in the sand, and was honored by 5 kingdoms not with gold, but with grace. And though Boone disappeared again soon after, heading toward the rising sun, his story remained, etched in the memory of a people who had finally seen what true power looked like, a man with nothing left, choosing to give anyway. The 5 horses remained in Red Hollow, but not as trophies. Boone's only request was that each beast serve the people. The first was given to the town's midwife, who had once walked miles through snow to deliver children in silence. The second pulled the wagon of an elderly farmer who had lost his sons to war. The third became the mount of the town's only doctor, who often traveled through storms to reach the sick. The fourth was offered to the orphanage, its saddle used to teach children how to ride, how to trust. And the fifth, the most regal of them all, was left unsaddled, untethered, free to roam the edge of the valley. Let it remind us, Boone had said, that not all strength is meant to be ridden. People began to talk, but not with the gossip of before. Now, his name, whispered around firelight and carved into fence posts, was spoken with a kind of quiet reverence. Boone, they'd say, was what the West forgot it needed. He didn't kill to prove his worth, didn't wear a star to claim justice. He fed the lost. He saw the invisible. He gave what he had, then walked away. His story made its way into songs sung by saloon pianists and prayers whispered by wagon families crossing the plains. Some tried to follow him, young men who wanted to be remembered, old men looking for redemption. But they learned quickly, Boone wasn't a trail to be followed. He was a question to be asked. What would you give, even if it cost you everything? In towns touched by his story, people began to change. Wells were dug not for profit, but for community. Fences were moved to share grazing land. Bread was left on doorsteps, water shared without asking for a name. Kindness, once seen as weakness in the West, became the mark of the brave. And yet, Boone never returned to Red Hollow. Not because he was unwelcome, but because he had never belonged to one place. He belonged to the road, to the dust, to the desperate prayers whispered in the heat of day and the cold of night. Every so often, a traveler would swear they saw him, in the shadow of a canyon wall, under the awning of a trading post, or riding alone at dusk. Always with that same quiet face. Always leaving just after helping someone who didn't even know they needed help. Years passed, but the legend grew stronger. Not exaggerated, not gilded, just remembered, detail by sacred detail. A man gave his last water to a stranger. That stranger turned out to be a prince. And the world responded, not because of who the stranger was, but because of who the giver chose to be. In a land built on survival, Boone reminded them what it meant to live. Decades later, when the children of Red Hollow grew into the elders of new towns, they would sit their own little ones down and tell the story not as history, but as heritage. They'd point to the old stable still holding the fourth horse, now grayed with age, still gentle, still strong. They'd touch the carving over the orphanage door that read, "Water shared as life returned." They'd recall how the fifth horse, the untethered one, still wandered the ridge every now and then, as if searching for the man who let it run free. A letter once arrived in Red Hollow. No return name, no signature, just words written in faded ink. The desert gives back more than it takes, if you give without expecting anything in return. It was placed in the center of the chapel, under glass, where it remains to this day. No one knows if Boone wrote it, but no one questioned it either, because every word echoed what he had shown them. That sacrifice isn't the end of something. Sometimes it's the very beginning. Eventually, Boone's story reached the eastern tribes once again. The kings who had once knelt were long gone, but their sons and grandsons still remembered. One of them, Kalen's youngest descendant, traveled west in secret. He walked the trail his ancestor nearly died on. He brought with him no guards, no riches, only a satchel of water and a carving of a man and a horse. When he reached Red Hollow, he said nothing. He just knelt beside the old chapel and placed the carving at its steps. The townsfolk understood. They welcomed him not as royalty, but as a brother. That's what Boone had built, not an empire, but a brotherhood. A belief that no man should walk through dust and desperation alone. That even when the sun scorches and the winds howl, and everything in you wants to hold tight to what little you have, you still give. Because sometimes the smallest gesture echoes the loudest across time. And so, whenever someone in the West lifts a stranger from the dirt, pours a drink before asking questions, or gives with no name and no witness, the old ones say, Boone's still out there. Maybe not in flesh, maybe not on horseback, but in spirit, in choice, in the quiet heroism of those who, when the time comes, give their last drop and light a fire the world never forgets. As the seasons wore on, Red Hollow became a town not defined by its buildings or its borders, but by its values. Travelers knew it before they even crossed its dusty limits. You could feel in the air the warmth of a welcome that didn't ask where you'd come from, only if you needed something. Merchants gave fair weights, not because they feared the law, but because Boone once walked those streets. Children left water out by their doors each morning, just in case a thirsty soul passed through. They didn't call it tradition. They called it right. Every year, on the day Boone was believed to have given his last water, the town went quiet at midday. No bells rang, no hammer struck. Families gathered by the well, each holding a small tin cup. They took a single sip, then poured the rest into the ground, a ritual that seemed small but meant everything. So the land remembers. They'd whisper, and whether the earth heard them or not, the people did. That one act connected them to something older than law, older than nation, something that couldn't be bought, only passed on. One young boy once asked his teacher, why didn't Boone take the horses for himself? The answer was simple but sharp, because he didn't need them to know who he was. That became a kind of creed in Red Hollow, that you're not measured by what you keep, but by what you give away. It reshaped the town's soul. Where once men bragged about how much land they owned, now they were known for who they had helped. And if you listened closely during quiet evenings, you could still hear stories being told, not of gunfights or gold, but of grace. Even beyond Red Hollow, Boone's spirit left footprints. Entire caravans rerouted just to stop at the place where the Five Horses once stood. A desert town near the border, once notorious for its lawlessness, renamed its main square Boone's Mercy. A painter from the capital came, hoping to capture Boone's face, but no one had a picture. Instead, they described him in feelings: calm, strong, kind. The painter left frustrated, but ended up sketching 5 wild horses beneath a blazing sun. That image now hangs in the center of Red Hollow's chapel. But Boone himself? He remained a shadow, a myth with roots. Some say he rode into the mountains to die in peace. Others claim he still rides, watching over towns on the edge of collapse, ready to offer the last of what he has to those who think they have nothing left. Wherever he is, no one's ever caught him. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Boone was never meant to be found again, only remembered in the moments when we choose love over survival. There was one final chapter the town rarely spoke aloud, but everyone knew. Years after Boone vanished, an elderly woman arrived on foot, wrapped in a sun-faded shawl, her eyes like storm clouds, deep and distant. She didn't speak much, but she carried a worn letter folded into 4 perfect creases. It was addressed not to Boone, but to the one who understands. Inside, written in the same firm, scratchy hand Red Hollow had seen before, were only 6 words. If they're thirsty, give them everything. The woman was given a room at the inn, but she never stayed indoors. She spent her nights under the stars, staring eastward, whispering to the wind. When asked who she was, she simply replied, "A witness." She never said more, but something about her presence felt like a closing circle, as if Boone's story had found its final page not in death, but in remembrance. When she passed quietly in her sleep, the town buried her beside the chapel, without a name, just like Boone would have wanted. On her grave, they etched only the words she carried. By then, Red Hollow had grown, not in size, but in spirit. There were no mayors, only stewards. No sheriff, only volunteers. Decisions were made by listening. Problems were solved with bread before bullets. They didn't fear being seen as weak. They feared forgetting what strength really meant. Newcomers who stayed often spoke of feeling safe in a way they couldn't explain, as if something older than wood and stone was holding the town together. Something invisible, something sacred. And through all those years, the Five Horses, or their descendants, remained. They aged, were cared for, and when the time came, were buried with honor. Not in fields, but in the center of the town's memory. Small stones marked each burial site, and children would leave apple slices and notes folded with crayon drawings. One note, written by a girl no older than 6, simply said, "If I had water, I would give it to you." And that was enough. So Boone's name faded from ledgers and maps, but not from hearts. He had rewritten what a hero could be in the West, not with iron or fire, but with dust, silence, and sacrifice. His legend, passed from voice to voice, was never shouted. It was shared like water in the heat, and in that sharing, it became eternal. Somewhere far beyond the valley, where mountains cast long shadows over old trade routes and hawks circled the sky in silence, Boone's name began to rise in the stories of strangers. A traveler in New Mexico swore that a man matching Boone's description helped him carry a wounded mule through a canyon pass, then disappeared before he could say thank you. A woman in Utah claimed a man with fire in his eyes and dust in his beard had left food and water at her doorstep after her husband died. No one could prove it. No one needed to. In every corner of the West, there seemed to be echoes, not of a ghost, but of a man who had simply never stopped giving. But Red Hollow didn't chase those rumors. They didn't turn his story into gold or spectacle. Instead, they taught their children not to look for Boone out there, but to be Boone right here. Every schoolhouse had a wall where children could hang drawings of someone they had helped. Every winter, the town gathered firewood not just for themselves, but for anyone who might go without. The old jailhouse became a shelter. The saloon kept one chair empty each night. a tradition the owner said was for the next soul that might be thirsty. By the 100th year since Boone gave his last drop of water, Red Hollow had changed completely. No longer a dusty stop on the way to somewhere else. It had become a symbol, a living story. Pilgrims arrived not with cameras or maps, but with questions in their hearts. How did he do it? Why didn't he keep the water? Would I have done the same? These questions weren't answered with lectures. They were answered with meals, with shelter, with the quiet act of listening, because that was how Boone answered the world. Not with explanations, but with action. One particular summer, a drought struck the region hard. Wells dried, crops withered, and tempers flared. But Red Hollow didn't crumble. They rationed not with resentment, but with reverence. Water was shared like it was sacred, and every ladle passed between hands came with a whisper. Boone would have done the same. And in the hottest hour of the driest day, when the town seemed to sway under the weight of the sun, clouds gathered. Rain fell. Not a storm, just enough to soften the soil, to lift the spirits, to remind them that mercy still existed. Some said it was coincidence. Others said it was Boone. A saddle still hangs above the chapel door, old and cracked, but never forgotten. It's said to be Boone's, though no one knows for sure. But that's the beauty of it. Certainty was never the point. The saddle, like the man, represents something deeper. It waits there in silence, year after year, like a quiet invitation to whoever passes beneath. If the moment comes, and the choice is yours, will you give your last water? 2. One spring, a group of riders from distant territories arrived unannounced. They came from places most had only heard about. Mountain towns built from stone, desert villages where the wind never stopped blowing. Each rider carried a gift, a relic, a story, a memory. One brought a hand-woven blanket stitched with Boone's likeness. Another offered a journal filled with accounts of those whose lives had been saved by strangers claiming to follow Boone's way. They asked for nothing in return. They only wanted to say thank you, not to Boone, but to Red Hollow, because the town had kept the story alive. A new monument was raised that year, not in stone, but in shadow and fire. On a quiet hill, overlooking the same trails Boone once rode, 5 torches were built in a perfect arc. Each represented a kingdom that once sent a horse. Every evening at dusk, one torch would be lit, rotating in a sacred rhythm, a reminder that Boone's gift hadn't faded, only changed hands. Children were taught the meaning of each flame. Elders stood in silence as the fire crackled, and once a year, all 5 would burn together under the stars, lighting up the valley like a heartbeat in the dark. An old man named Silas, the last known grandson of one of Boone's companions, took it upon himself to gather all the town's oral stories. He didn't write them in books. He carved them into wood, tall planks that now line the walkway to the chapel. Each plank bears a single phrase, etched deep by his calloused hands. He gave his last drop. 5 kings came. He asked for nothing. We are his echo. Tourists read them in awe. Locals passed by them without needing to stop. The words are already etched into their hearts. As Red Hollow continued to grow, new generations brought new questions. Could kindness survive in the modern world? Could Boone's values still stand when the world moved faster, colder, louder? The answer wasn't found in speeches or debates. It was found when a teenage girl gave her lunch to a stranger. When a farmer, after losing half his crop, helped his neighbor harvest what remained. When water was left on the edge of town without name or a note, just presence. Every time someone chose compassion, Boone was there. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of all, that the man who gave his last water didn't just save a prince. He saved the soul of a land that still, to this day, stops to listen when the wind carries his name and answers, not with noise, but with quiet acts of grace. Over time, Boone's legend seeped into places it had never touched before. The ink of his story found its way into songs sung on distant coasts, into quiet bedtime tales told in cabins carved into mountain passes. He became more than a man. He became a symbol, not of heroism in the traditional sense, but of choice. A reminder that in the harshest places, with the least to give, one act of mercy could shift the course of everything. Scholars would later argue whether he had ever truly existed. But the people who carried water in his name didn't need proof. They live the evidence every single day. It was said that in one small mining town, a collapse trapped 6 men beneath the earth. The oxygen was running thin, hope even thinner. But when rescuers finally broke through the rock, they found the men alive. All because one of them, a stranger passing through, had rationed his water between them, sip by sip, even as his own breath faded. Before dying, he had said only one thing: "Tell them Boone taught me." That moment was engraved in the town's memory, and his name joined Boone's on a plaque above the mine's entrance. And so the tale kept expanding, not as fantasy, but as fuel. Boone's actions birthed a movement that asked nothing but awareness. No institution was created, no laws were passed, and yet towns across the territories began marking the Day of the Water every spring, a day to give something of value to someone without expecting it back. No ceremonies, no applause, just quiet ripples of grace, repeating endlessly in Boone's rhythm. But Red Hollow remained the heart of it all. Though its buildings changed, its people did not. Every new family was welcomed not just with a handshake, but with a story. Newborns were often named Elijah. And at the edge of town, where the trail disappears into a ridge of rocks and sagebrush, a small wooden post was planted. On it, carved by a hand grown old with time, were the words, "This way, if you're looking for him." No one ever followed it with certainty, but many stopped to touch it, to close their eyes and breathe deep, as if Boone himself had just passed by. It didn't matter where he went, or if he ever returned. Boone had done what few ever could. He left a trail of goodness wide enough for others to walk. And that, in a world that often forgets the quiet ones, was a miracle all its own. One bitter winter, nearly a century and a half since Boone gave his final water, Red Hollow was blanketed in snow so deep it silenced even the wind. Roads were closed. Supplies ran thin. Power lines failed. But no one panicked. Instead, the town gathered in the chapel, huddled around fire pits, passing bread and blankets between strangers. The mayor, a title now given only in name, stood with the oldest member of the town and said, "We've done this before. We'll do it again." And they did. That storm lasted 5 days. But not a single life was lost. And when the sun finally broke through the clouds, it revealed something astonishing. Carved into the snowdrifts on the ridge above the chapel, as if by unseen hands, were the outlines of 5 horses facing east. No footprints, no tracks, just the shapes, perfect and still. The people of Red Hollow stood in silence. Some cried, others knelt, not because they believed Boone had returned, but because they believed he had never left. The story continued, not in grand declarations, but in small, sacred choices. A teacher paying for a child's boots. A rancher delivering firewood to a family without heat. A young boy refusing his own meal until his sister had eaten. These weren't acts performed for praise. They were woven into the soul of the people, passed like water between hands, chosen again and again. That was Boone's final gift. Not what he gave, but what he awakened. And in the quiet moments, when the sky turned orange over the desert, you could still hear it, the distant sound of hooves, slow and steady, like a memory returning. Some say it's the wind. Others say it's the soul of the West, remembering the man who taught it to be soft again. Whatever the truth is, the flame never went out. It flickers in every heart that dares to love first, to give last, to kneel when the world demands you rise. Because somewhere in that vast, endless land, a man once gave his final drink of water, and the world never forgot him. In a land where survival was often valued more than sacrifice, one man taught the West a different language, the quiet language of giving. Elijah Boone didn't carry a badge, command an army, or speak in grand speeches. He carried water, and when faced with a moment that could have saved his own life, he gave that water away. That single act, unnoticed at first, echoed through kingdoms, crossed borders, softened hardened hearts, and reshaped entire towns. He proved that true power doesn't come from what we keep, but from what we're willing to give when it costs us the most. Boone's legacy isn't marked by monuments. It lives in the moments that no one sees. A door opened to a stranger, a meal shared without question, a choice made, not for glory, but for grace. He didn't change the world with a weapon. He changed it with water. and long after his name faded from records, it remained etched in the choices of people who remembered that giving isn't about abundance. It's about intention, about heart, about understanding that even in the most desolate places, compassion can still bloom like wildflowers through the dust. If Boone's story teaches us anything, it's this. You don't need a crown to be honored by kings. You don't need riches to leave behind something everlasting. You just need to see someone in need and act. In a time where noise often replaces meaning, and people are praised for taking more than they give, Boone's silence speaks louder than ever. His life was a question posed to every generation. When the time comes, will you hold what you have, or will you give away? And now, perhaps it's your turn. Maybe you won't meet a prince in the desert, but someone, somewhere, will need you. Not for everything, just for one act, one word, one gesture. And when that moment comes, remember the man who gave everything, not for a reward, but because it was right. That's the kind of story that doesn't end. It lives on in you. If this story touched you in any way, let it continue. Subscribe to the channel so more people can walk this trail with us. Like the video if Boone's journey moved you, and share in the comments what you would give, even when you have little left. Sometimes, your story might be the drop of water someone else is waiting for.